They think the GULAG breaks a man. They are wrong. It doesn't break you. It empties you. It scrapes out everything soft, everything human, until you are nothing but a hollow shell filled with cold black ice. You forget the taste of real food. You forget the warmth of a woman's skin. You forget what it feels like to walk without looking over your shoulder, waiting for a guard to slam a rifle butt into your spine. For 12 long years, that was my life. 12 years in the frozen hell of Camp 36, digging through the permafrost with bleeding hands for a crime I never committed. They called me an enemy of the state, but my only state was my wife, Maria. Her face was the only thing that kept the frost from freezing my heart solid. My name is Nikolai. In the gray, suffocating winter of 1978, the iron gates finally groaned open. They handed me a ragged set of civilian clothes, a train ticket, and a piece of paper that said I was allowed to exist again. But freedom is a terrifying thing when you have been a ghost for over a decade. When I stepped off the train in my hometown, the air didn't smell like freedom. It smelled of cheap coal, damp concrete, and industrial rot. The sky was a heavy, low ceiling of white, pressing down on the gray brick buildings of the town. Nobody was waiting for me at the platform. No tears, no warm embraces. Just the biting Siberian wind that cut straight through my thin worker's jacket. I walked through the streets I used to know, but everything felt wrong. The people moved like shadows, heads down, eyes fixed on the dirty snow, wrapped in heavy wool coats. There was a strange, suffocating silence hanging over the city. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a small town. It was the tense, terrified silence of a place that was being suffocated from the inside. Maria's letters had stopped coming exactly 4 years ago. The prison censors told me she had moved away. The guards laughed and said she had found a younger, better man who wasn't rotting in a ditch. But I knew my Maria. We had survived the hunger of the post-war years together. We had built our lives out of nothing. She wouldn't just vanish. She wouldn't stop writing. My boots crunched on the frozen gravel as I approached our small wooden house on the northern edge of the city, near the old railway tracks. From a distance, my heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. But as I got closer, the hope died. The front gate was hanging off its hinges, half buried in a snowdrift. The small garden we had planted together, where she used to grow radishes and marigolds, was choked with dead frozen weeds. The windows were completely boarded up with rough gray planks like a blind man's eyes. I walked up the creaking wooden steps of the porch. The padlock on the door was covered in rust. I didn't have a key, so I kicked it. 12 years of anger went into that kick. The wood splintered and the door swung open with a heavy, protesting groan. Inside, the cold was deeper than the cold outside. It was a stagnant, dead cold. The air was thick with the smell of dust, damp wallpaper, and abandonment. I walked into the small kitchen. A cracked teacup still sat on the wooden table, covered in a thick layer of gray dust. On the floor lay a single faded leather shoe, Maria's shoe. My knees buckled, and I sank into the dust, clutching that piece of leather to my chest. The house was a tomb, and I was just another corpse walking through it. I didn't cry. The GULAG drains the tears out of you in the first 6 months. But a dark, heavy weight settled deep inside my chest. A weight that demanded answers. The next morning I went to the local militia precinct. The building was an ugly gray concrete block with a red Soviet flag freezing on the roof. Inside it smelled of cheap tobacco, wet wool, and stale sweat. I stood at the iron bars of the front desk for 20 minutes before a fat desk sergeant even looked at me. His uniform was stained and his eyes were bloodshot. I told him my name. I told him I was looking for my wife, Maria Voronova. The moment I said her name, The sergeant's hand froze over his tea. He didn't look me in the eyes anymore. He stood up without a word, walked into a back room, and closed the door. I waited. 10 minutes later, he came back with a thin, yellowed file. He flipped through the papers with dirty fingers, clearing his throat. "Typhus," he said, his voice flat, like he was reading a grocery list. Winter of 1974. There was an outbreak in the Northern District. She died in the municipal hospital, buried in a mass grave at the edge of the city cemetery. No ceremony. Next question. I stared at him through the bars. I had seen hundreds of men die of typhus in the camps. I knew what the paperwork looked like, and I knew how men talked when they were telling the truth. This man was reciting a script. His boots were tapping nervously against the floor, and he kept glancing at a closed door down the hallway, the door to the chief's office. "Where is the hospital report?" I asked, my voice dropping to a low, gravelly whisper that made him flinch. "Where is the doctor's signature?" "The file is closed, Zek," the sergeant snapped, trying to sound tough, but his hand was shaking as he shut the folder. "You just got out of the camps. If I were you, I'd take my papers, find a job at the factory, and keep my mouth shut. The world has changed while you were away. Don't dig into things that don't concern you anymore." I didn't argue. I didn't yell. In the GULAG, if you show your teeth too early, they knock them out. I turned around and walked out into the freezing air. But I knew with every fiber of my being that they were covering up a corpse. I spent the next 3 days in the darkest corners of the town. I didn't go to the authorities. I went to the people who actually knew the truth because they lived in the dirt. I visited the cheap beer halls, the train station waiting rooms, and the black markets where people traded bread for stolen coats. I bought cheap bootleg vodka for the old railway workers, the beggars, and the old women who sat on the benches near Maria's street. It cost me my last few rubles, but vodka opens doors that the law keeps locked. On the third night, in the back of a filthy basement tavern, an old man named Uncle Misha, a man who worked the graveyard shift at the railway station for 30 years, finally cracked. He took a long drag from his unfiltered cigarette, looked around the dark room to make sure nobody was listening, and leaned in close. His breath smelled of sour alcohol and decay. "They lied to you, Kolya," he whispered, his eyes wide with an old, deep-seated terror. "Everyone knows what happened, but everyone is too afraid to die. Maria didn't die of any sickness. They hunted her down like an animal." Uncle Misha's hands shook so badly he dropped his cigarette onto the sticky wooden table. I picked it up, handed it back to him, and poured him another glass of the burning liquid. "Tell me," I said. Just 2 words, but they carried the weight of 12 years of stone quarries. "It was the winter of 74, Misha muttered, staring into his glass. "The town had been taken over by monsters. A gang. They call themselves the Iron Ivan Boys. They control everything now, the restaurants, the black market goods, the gold smuggling from the northern mines. The militia doesn't touch them. Why? Because Captain Borodin, the precinct chief, is in their pocket. He eats from their hands like a dog." He leaned even closer, his voice sinking so low I could barely hear it over the noise of the tavern. "Your Maria, she still had that gold locket, the one her mother gave her before the war. Pure pre-revolutionary gold, with 3 small diamonds. She never took it off. She wore it inside her collar, but someone saw it. One of Ivan's thugs, a low-life driver named Pasha. He told the boss." My grip on the glass tightened until the thick glass cracked under my fingers. A small drop of blood mixed with the spilled vodka on the table. I didn't feel it. "They cornered her," Misha continued, a tear cutting a clean line through the dirt on his cheek. right behind the state bakery in the dark alley. She fought them. She wasn't a coward, Kolya. She screamed for the militia, but the patrol was ordered to stay away. Pasha and 2 others. They didn't just take the locket. They beat her to stop her from talking. When they realized she was dead, they panicked. They called Borodin. The captain came himself in his official car. They threw her body in the back, and the next day the paperwork said, typhus. Borodin took the locket as his payment. He gave it to his mistress and Ivan's boys. They walked away free men. They are still walking. Ivan bought a massive dacha in the pine forest, and Pasha drives a brand new Volga. Misha grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my jacket. Don't go after them, Kolya. They will bury you next to her, and nobody will ever find the grave. The law belongs to them. I stood up from the table. I pulled my arm away from his grip. The dark weight in my chest was gone, replaced by a strange, terrifying clarity. The system had stolen my youth. The system had allowed monsters to destroy the only thing I loved. The law was a lie written by the men who killed my wife. I walked out of the tavern into the blinding Siberian blizzard. The wind was howling, throwing sharp needles of ice against my face. But for the first time in 12 years, I wasn't cold. A fire had started deep inside me. A black, consuming fire that wouldn't stop burning until this town was cleansed in blood. I didn't need their law. I had my own. I was going to find my old infantry rifle, and I was going to show these monsters what the GULAG teaches a man about survival. To kill a wolf, you must first leave the village and go where the beasts hide. I knew I couldn't stay at my boarded-up home anymore. Captain Borodin's informants would soon report that a ghost from the past was asking questions in the dark corners of the city. I needed a base, a shadow to fade into. On the northern outskirts of the town, near the frozen marshlands, stood the old ruined district of wooden houses. They had been abandoned years ago when the state began constructing the gray concrete apartment complexes closer to the center. It was a wasteland of rotten timber, shattered glass, and forgotten memories, perfect for a man like me. I broke into a small, half-collapsed house that sat choked under a heavy snowdrift. The roof had caved in on one side, but the cellar was dry and hidden from the road. I wrapped my heavy sheepskin coat tightly around my shoulders and sat on an upturned wooden crate in the dark, watching the pale winter sunlight cut through the cracks in the walls. The cold was a familiar enemy. It didn't scare me. It kept my mind sharp. I closed my eyes and remembered the day I was arrested in 1966. I remembered the heavy infantry rifle I had smuggled back from the front lines of World War II. It was a Mosin-Nagant bolt-action rifle, a reliable piece of Soviet steel that had saved my life more than once in the forests near Berlin. Before the KGB took me, I had wrapped it in thick oil-soaked rags and buried it deep beneath the floorboards of the old railway tool shed, 300 meters down the tracks from this very house. I waited until midnight, when the blizzard was at its fiercest, obscuring all vision and muffling all sound. I crept through the snow like a wraith, my boots making no sound against the howling wind. The railway shed was half buried, its iron door frozen solid. I used a rusty iron crowbar to force the lock, slipping into the pitch-black interior. I knelt in the freezing dust, digging into the frozen earth beneath the floorboards with my bare fingers until my nails bled. But I didn't care about the pain. My fingers hit something hard and wrapped in heavy canvas. I dragged it out into the dim starlight. When I tore away the oil-soaked rags, the rifle was pristine. The metal was dark, cold, and free of rust. I slid the bolt back. It moved with a heavy, satisfying metallic click. I had buried 30 rounds of ammunition with it, sealed in a tin can. The grease had protected them perfectly. I loaded 5 heavy cartridges into the internal magazine. As the metal slipped into place, I felt a strange shift inside my chest. For 12 years, I had been helpless, a number, a slave. But holding that rifle, I was Nikolai again, the soldier, the hunter, the law. My first target was Pasha. Uncle Misha had told me that Pasha was a low-level thug, a driver who had become wealthy by selling stolen goods and doing the dirty work for Iron Ivan. He lived in a brick house with a private brick garage in the newer district of the town. He was proud of his new white Volga car, a luxury that only high-ranking party officials or successful criminals could afford in the Soviet Union. He thought he was a king. He thought the law protected him because Captain Borodin was his friend. He didn't know that the shadows were watching him. For 2 days, I sat in the ruins of an abandoned bakery across the street from his garage, wrapped in my dark coat, observing his routine. Pasha was a creature of habit. Every evening at exactly 8 o'clock, he would drive his Volga into the garage, lock the heavy iron doors from the inside, and spend an hour polishing the chrome or drinking beer with other local thugs. He felt completely safe inside his brick fortress. On the third night, the snow stopped, leaving the air biting and still. At 7:45, I crept into the narrow alley behind his garage. The side window was high up, but the wooden frame was old and rotten. I used my combat knife to gently shave away the wood near the latch, slipping the blade inside to slide the lock open. I climbed through the window without a sound, landing softly on a pile of oily rags in the corner. The garage was cold, smelling of gasoline, motor oil, and cheap exhaust. I moved to the darkest corner, behind a stack of spare rubber tires, and sat down on the concrete floor, my rifle resting across my knees. I became part of the shadows. I waited in absolute stillness, barely breathing, letting the darkness consume me. At exactly 8 o'clock, the heavy iron doors groaned open from the outside. The headlights of the white Volga pierced the dark, blinding and bright. The engine roared, filling the enclosed space with a heavy cloud of gray smoke as Pasha rolled the car inside. He turned off the ignition, and the headlights died, plunging the garage back into a dim, murky twilight, illuminated only by a single bare yellow light bulb hanging from the ceiling. Pasha stepped out of the vehicle. He was a short, thick-set man with a heavy gold ring on his finger and a thick leather jacket that looked too expensive for him. He was whistling a popular Soviet pop tune, completely unaware that the air in the room had already turned into his tomb. He walked to the front of the car, popped the hood, and leaned over the engine, his back turned completely toward the dark corner where I sat. I stood up from the shadows. The floor was cold concrete, but my boots made no sound. I walked until I was standing just 3 steps behind him. The metallic click of my rifle bolt sliding forward was the loudest sound in the room. Pasha froze. He didn't turn around immediately. He stood completely still over the engine bay, his whistling cutting off instantly. He could feel the cold barrel of the Mosin-Nagant pressing directly against the back of his neck, right where his expensive leather collar ended. "Don't move," I whispered. My voice didn't sound human. It sounded like the grating of heavy iron gates. "If you scream, your brains will paint the windshield of your beautiful car." His hands began to shake violently against the metal hood. Who are you?" he stammered, his voice cracking with a sudden suffocating terror. "What do you want? Money? Gold? I have rubles in the glove box. Take it all. Just don't shoot." "Turn around, slowly," I commanded. He turned, his back pressing against the radiator grill. When his eyes adjusted to the dim light and saw my face, the face of a dead man from the past, scarred by the stone quarries of the GULAG, his jaw dropped. He recognized me. He had seen photos of me in Maria's album before they killed her. His face turned the color of the dirty snow outside. "Kolya," he breathed. his knees buckling so badly he had to catch himself on the car's fender. "Kolya, listen to me. It wasn't me. I swear by my mother it wasn't me. It was Ivan. Iron Ivan ordered it. We just wanted the locket. We didn't mean to kill her. She fought back. She wouldn't let go." "Where is the locket now?" I asked, keeping the rifle steady, aimed directly between his terrified, wide eyes. "Borodin has it!" Pasha screamed, tears finally spilling over his fat cheeks. "Captain Borodin took it. He gave it to his woman. Please, Kolya, I have a family. I have a son. Don't do this." I looked at him. I looked into his cowardly eyes, the eyes of a monster who had listened to my wife scream for mercy in a dark alley and felt nothing. And now he was begging me for his life, invoking his own child. "My wife had a family too," I said softly. "She had me. But you forgot about that." I didn't pull the trigger. Shooting him would be too quick, too loud, too merciful. I forced him at gunpoint to sit in the driver's seat of his Volga. I took a heavy roll of industrial wire from his own workbench and bound his hands tightly to the steering wheel, wrapping the metal cords until they cut into his skin. He wept and begged, but I didn't say another word. I opened a jerry can of gasoline and poured it over the back seats, over the carpet, and over his lap. The fumes made him choke and scream. I walked to the garage door, stepping outside into the freezing night. I turned back, pulled a single box of matches from my pocket, struck one, and dropped it onto the gasoline-soaked floorboards near the threshold. The fire caught instantly, a roaring wave of orange light that illuminated his terrified face through the windshield. I closed the heavy iron doors from the outside and slid the heavy iron bolt into place, locking him inside his own tomb. As I walked away into the darkness of the blizzard, his muffled screams began to echo through the brick walls, but the howling Siberian wind drowned them out, washing the town clean of his existence. One down, two to go. The news of Pasha's death spread through the city like wildfire, but the militia didn't know what they were dealing with. To them, a criminal burning alive inside his own locked garage looked like a brutal message from a rival gang. They thought it was a dispute over black market profits or stolen gold. They were looking for a group of thugs with submachine guns. They weren't looking for a ghost with an old infantry rifle and a heart turned to stone. But Captain Borodin wasn't a fool. He knew that Pasha had been involved in something dark 4 years ago, and he knew that I had been asking questions at the precinct just days before. He started getting paranoid. He doubled the guards at his office and stopped walking the streets alone. But every man, no matter how powerful or corrupt, has a weakness. Borodin's weakness was his secret cabin in the dense pine forest, 20 kilometers north of the city. It was a private luxury estate built with stolen state materials, hidden away from the prying eyes of the party inspectors. Every Friday evening, he would leave the precinct early, shake off his bodyguards, and drive out to his dacha to drink imported cognac and meet with his mistresses. He thought the isolation of the forest made him safe. He thought the trees would keep his dirty secrets. He didn't realize that the forest was my home long before it was his playground. On Friday afternoon, the sky turned a dark, bruised purple, and a heavy Siberian frost settled over the region, freezing the dirt roads into treacherous sheets of ice. I didn't take a car. A car makes noise, and a car can be tracked. I walked through the deep snowbanks along the edge of the forest, carrying my Mosin-Nagant rifle wrapped in a dark cloth. I knew the road to his cabin perfectly. It was a narrow, winding track through the pines, with a steep, dangerous drop into a frozen swamp on one side. I found the perfect spot near a sharp bend where the trees grew thick and close to the gravel. I waited for 3 hours in the freezing dark, lying flat in the snow, completely motionless. My military training from the Great War came back to me effortlessly. In the GULAG, if you move too much in the cold, you burn your energy and die. You learn to become like a stone, letting the frost cover you until you are invisible. My breaths were shallow, disappearing into the dark air. And then, around 7 in the evening, I saw the pale yellow headlights cutting through the falling snow. It was Borodin's official Soviet Jeep, the UAZ 469, crawling slowly over the icy ruts of the road. He was driving too fast for the conditions, arrogant and confident in his power. As the Jeep rounded the sharp corner, I didn't shoot at him. I shot at his front left tire. The heavy lead bullet tore through the rubber and shattered the wheel rim with a loud metallic explosion. The heavy Jeep veered violently to the side, the frozen steering wheel ripping out of Borodin's hands. The vehicle skidded sideways across the ice, flipped over once, and crashed heavily down the embankment, nose first into the frozen mud of the ditch. The headlights flickered and died, leaving only the sound of steaming radiator fluid hissed against the cold snow. I slid down the snowy embankment, my rifle held ready at my hip. The Jeep was resting on its side, the metal frame twisted and groaning under its own weight. I reached the driver's side door and wrenched it open with a hard pull. Inside, Captain Borodin was tangled in the steering column, groaning in pain. His expensive fur hat had fallen off, and a thick stream of dark blood was running down his forehead from a deep cut near his hairline. His pristine militia uniform, with all its silver medals and high-ranking patches, was covered in dirt and broken glass. I grabbed him by his heavy leather collar and dragged him out of the wreckage, throwing his heavy body onto the frozen snow. He gasped for air, his hands clutching his broken ribs as he looked up at me through the dark. When the moonlight hit my face, his eyes went wide with a sudden, paralyzing shock. The arrogance vanished from his features in an instant, replaced by the pale, sweaty look of a man who realized his executioner had arrived. "Nikolai," he wheezed, coughing up a spray of blood onto the white snow. "Listen to me. You're making a mistake. You're a rehabilitated citizen now. If you kill a high-ranking officer of the law, they will hunt you to the ends of the earth. They will execute you in a basement. There is no escape from this." "The law?" I asked, my voice flat, completely devoid of any anger or heat. "You lost the right to speak about the law the night you helped murder my Maria. You sold your badge to Iron Ivan for a handful of stolen gold. You buried her case under a mountain of lies. Where is the locket, Borodin?" He shook his head frantically, trying to crawl backward into the brush, his boots slipping helplessly on the ice. "I don't have it. I swear Yvonne took it. I only signed the death certificate. It was just paperwork, Nikolai. I didn't touch her. I wasn't even there." I stepped forward and slammed the heavy iron butt of my rifle directly into his knee. The bone shattered with a loud, sickening crunch that echoed through the quiet forest. Borodin let out a high-pitched, piercing scream that cut through the pines, his hands desperately wrapping around his ruined leg as he wept in the snow. "Don't lie to me again," I whispered, kneeling down beside him, the cold barrel of the rifle pressing hard against his bleeding cheek. "Pasha told me everything before he burned. He said you took the locket as your payment. He said you gave it to your woman. I went to her apartment last night while you were at work, Borodin. I found it in her jewelry box. I have it right here." I pulled the heavy gold chain out from beneath my jumpsuit, letting the 3 small diamonds catch the pale moonlight. The sight of it seemed to drain the last remaining bit of courage out of his body. He collapsed against the frozen dirt, shivering violently, knowing that his lies could no longer save him. "Please," Borodin whimpered, his voice dropping to a desperate crawl. "Take the money. I have a secret safe in the dacha. 50,000 rubles. Pure gold bars from the northern mines. It's yours. All of it. Just leave me here. Tell them it was an accident. The crash. The cold will finish me anyway. Just don't shoot me like a dog." I looked down at the fat, pathetic creature shivering in the dirt. This was the man who held the power of life and death over thousands of citizens in our town. This was the man who could destroy a family with a single stroke of his pen. And now he was offering me stolen gold to buy another hour of his miserable life. "You're right about one thing, Captain," I said softly, standing back up and slinging the rifle over my shoulder. "I'm not going to shoot you. A bullet is too good for a traitor who sold his country and his honor to thieves." I grabbed him by his ankles, ignoring his screams of agony as his shattered knee dragged across the frozen rocks. I hauled his heavy body 50 meters through the brush down to the edge of the frozen river that ran behind his property. The ice was thick near the banks, but out in the center, where the current was fast and deep, the ice sheet was thin and translucent, dangerous to walk on. I took a heavy iron logging chain from the back of his wrecked Jeep, which I had dragged down with us. I wrapped the heavy links tightly around his waist, securing it with a massive padlock. The other end of the chain was bolted to a heavy 50-kilogram iron boat anchor. I forced him at gunpoint to crawl out onto the ice sheet, dragging the heavy anchor behind him. He wept and prayed, invoking God, Lenin, and his family, his fingers tearing against the slick surface as he slid toward the center of the river. When he reached the dark, thin ice where the water rushed beneath, he stopped, paralyzed by terror. I raised my rifle, but I didn't aim at his body. I fired 3 heavy rounds directly into the ice sheet around his feet. The cracks spread instantly, like a spider's web, groaning under his weight. With a loud, terrifying snap, the ice gave way. Borodin let out one final choked scream as his heavy body and the massive iron anchor plunged into the black, rushing water of the river. The swift current dragged him instantly beneath the thick ice sheet further downstream. For a few seconds, I could see his white, terrified face pressing against the translucent ice from underneath, his fingers clawing desperately against the frozen ceiling, trying to find air. But there was no air. Only the dark, freezing water. Within a minute, his movement stopped, and he drifted away into the blackness of the Siberian winter, trapped forever in a tomb of ice. 2 down. Only the monster himself was left. With Pasha turned to ash and Captain Borodin rotting beneath the river ice, the criminal empire of our town began to collapse from the inside. Panic is a funny thing. It makes even the most dangerous predators act like cornered rats. Iron Ivan knew that someone was hunting his inner circle, but he still couldn't understand who it was. The rumor on the streets was that a ruthless executioner from a Moscow syndicate had arrived to take over the black market gold trade. Ivan didn't know that his enemy wasn't a syndicate. His enemy was just a man with a broken heart, sitting in a damp, freezing cellar on the edge of the city. I spent 3 days inside that concrete basement, preparing for the final act. The red light from a small portable heater painted the brick walls in the color of dried blood. I didn't feel hunger, and I didn't feel fatigue. The GULAG teaches you how to turn off your body when you need to survive. I sat on the cold floor, cleaning my rifle over and over again until the mechanism worked perfectly, without a single catch. I had only a dozen rounds of heavy ammunition left, but I didn't need an army. I had the darkness, and I had the tactical knowledge of a man who had cleared enemy bunkers during the Great War. Iron Ivan had pulled all his remaining thugs back to his main fortress, a massive 2-story wooden dacha surrounded by a high concrete wall, hidden deep inside the pine forest near the old brick factory. It was heavily guarded. There were at least 6 armed men patrolling the grounds with illegally modified hunting shotguns and stolen military pistols. They had floodlights illuminating the perimeter and 2 massive, half-starved guard dogs chained near the front gate. Ivan thought that behind those walls, surrounded by his personal army, He was untouchable. He thought a fortress could save him from his own sins. But every fortress has a flaw, and Ivan's flaw was his arrogance. He relied entirely on his technology and his numbers. He didn't realize that in a Siberian winter, the environment itself is the greatest weapon. On Tuesday night, a massive blizzard hit the region again. The wind howled through the concrete streets of the city, ripping down power lines and blinding anyone who dared to step outside. The temperature dropped to -35 degrees. This was the moment I had been waiting for. The storm was my cloak, and the freezing wind was my accomplice. I left the basement at midnight, carrying my rifle and a heavy combat knife. I didn't walk along the roads. I moved through the deep snowbanks of the forest, using the massive pine trees as cover. By the time I reached the concrete perimeter wall of Ivan's dacha, the snow was falling so thickly that you couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. The bright floodlights on the walls were useless. Their beams were choked by the swirling white void. The guard dogs were shivering inside their wooden kennels, their senses dulled by the freezing wind. I climbed the wall near the back transformer box, slipping into the compound like a shadow. My first task was to eliminate the security before they could sound the alarm. I crept toward the small wooden shack near the front gate where the guards usually sat to drink tea and play cards. Through the frosted window, I could see 3 men inside. They were laughing, a bottle of expensive bootleg vodka sitting open on the table between them. They felt completely safe inside their warm cabin, listening to the radio. They didn't hear me approach the external power box on the side of the building. I used my heavy iron crowbar to rip open the metal box, exposing the thick electrical cables that fed power to the entire dacha. With one swift, heavy cut of my insulated wire cutters, I severed the main line. Instantly, the compound was plunged into a suffocating, absolute pitch blackness. The loud hum of the electric heater died, and the bright floodlights vanished, leaving only the dark, screaming voice of the blizzard. Inside the shack, the laughter stopped instantly. I heard the muffled curses of the thugs as they scrambled in the dark, looking for flashlights or matches. The heavy wooden door swung open, and the first guard stepped out into the freezing night, holding a weak electric torch that barely cut through the falling snow. "Hey, Vasya!" he shouted into the wind, his voice shaking slightly from the sudden cold. "Check the generator. The damn lines must have frozen over again." He never got an answer. I stepped out from behind the corner of the building, my combat knife already moving in a swift, silent arc. The cold steel slid through his heavy winter collar, cutting off his breath before he could make a single sound. He collapsed into the deep snowdrift without a groan, his flashlight slipping from his fingers and burying itself in the white powder, casting a pale, dying glow against the blood. The second thug stepped out a minute later, growling in frustration because his companion hadn't returned. He stumbled directly over the body of his friend. Before his brain could process the sight of the blood, I was behind him. I wrapped my arm around his neck, choking his screams, and drove the knife deep into his spine. He stiffened, his muscles locking in a brief, violent spasm, and then went completely limp in my arms. I dragged both bodies into the darkness beneath the porch, out of sight. The third man inside the shack was still trying to light a candle when I stepped through the doorway. The last thing he saw in this world was the scarred face of a ghost appearing out of the blackness before the heavy steel butt of my infantry rifle shattered his skull. 3 down. Only the monster and his inner circle remained inside the main house. I left the guard shack and moved toward the main 2-story dacha. The massive wooden structure looked like a dark, dead leviathan in the middle of the snowy yard. Inside, I could hear panic beginning to take root. Ivan's remaining personal bodyguards were moving through the dark rooms with flashlights, their beams dancing frantically across the frosted windows like trapped fireflies. They knew something was wrong. They knew the silence outside wasn't natural. I didn't use the front door. It was heavily reinforced with iron plates. Instead, I moved to the kitchen window at the side of the house. The glass was thick, but the wooden frame was warped by the moisture. I pressed my heavy weight against the frame until the lock gave way with a low, muffled snap. I slipped inside, landing on the cold linoleum floor of the kitchen. The house smelled of expensive tobacco, roasted meat, and the heavy, sour sweat of terrified men. I stood in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the house. Upstairs, a heavy door slammed, and I heard the loud, angry voice of Iron Ivan himself, screaming at his men from the top of the staircase. "Find them," he roared, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and terror. "There's only one of them out there. I don't care who it is, KGB, Moscow criminals, or a devil from hell. Shoot anything that moves. If you let him into this house, I will skin you alive myself." Two of his remaining thugs came rushing down the wooden stairs, their flashlights cutting bright, erratic paths through the dark living room. They were holding short-barreled hunting shotguns, their fingers twitching nervously against the triggers. They were looking toward the front doors, expecting a siege. They didn't expect the hunter to already be inside their kitchen, waiting in the shadows behind the pantry door. As the first thug crossed the threshold into the hallway, I stepped out. I didn't waste my breath on words. I fired 2 rapid shots from my Mosin-Nagant rifle. The heavy, high-velocity bullets tore through their heavy leather jackets at point-blank range, lifting both men off their feet and slamming them heavily against the wooden wall. The loud, deafening roar of the rifle explosions shook the entire house, shattering the glass ornaments on the sideboard and filling the narrow hallway with a thick, suffocating cloud of acrid cordite smoke. The flashlights fell to the floor, their beams illuminating the gray smoke and the dark pools of blood spreading across the expensive rugs. The house went completely silent again, except for the desperate, terrified sound of Iron Ivan's breathing from the top of the stairs. He was alone now. His empire was gone. His army was dead, and the ghost from the past was walking up the steps to collect the final debt. The wooden stairs groaned beneath my boots as I walked up to the second floor. Each step felt heavy, like a judge walking into a courtroom. The smoke from my rifle followed me, a gray shroud drifting through the dark hallways of the dacha. At the end of the corridor, behind a heavy oak door, I could hear him. Iron Ivan, the man who thought he owned this city, the man whose name made tough men whisper in fear. Now he was making a pathetic, wet sound, the sound of a cornered animal realizing the trap has snapped shut. I didn't try to turn the handle. I raised my heavy boot and kicked the oak door right next to the lock. The wood splintered with a loud crack, and the door flew open, bouncing off the wall. Ivan was standing behind his massive mahogany desk. In his right hand, he was holding a short, silver-plated foreign pistol. His hand was shaking so violently that the barrel was dancing in the dark. The single candle he had lit on his desk cast long, twisting shadows across his face. The fearsome gangster king was gone. In his place stood a fat, sweating 50-year-old coward with eyes wide from a primitive, suffocating terror. "Stay back," he screamed, his voice cracking like dry winter wood. "I'll shoot. I swear to God I'll blow your head off. Who sent you? Was it the Moscow boys? I can double whatever they are paying you. I have 300,000 rubles in gold bars under the floorboards. Take it and walk away." I didn't say a word. I just kept walking toward him, my rifle aimed directly at his chest. He panicked and pulled the trigger. 3 loud shots exploded in the small room. One bullet tore through the sleeve of my jacket. Another shattered a glass bookcase behind me, spraying cold shards across my neck. But I didn't even blink. In the GULAG, you learn that fear is what kills you before the bullet does. If your time has come, it has come. If not, you keep moving. Before he could fire a 4th time, I closed the distance. I swung the barrel of my Mosin-Nagant down, striking his right wrist with a heavy, crushing blow. The silver pistol flew out of his hand, shattering the window glass behind him as it dropped into the dark snow yard below. Ivan let out a pathetic, high-pitched shriek and collapsed back into his heavy leather chair, clutching his broken, bleeding wrist to his chest. I stood over him, the dark shadow of his worst nightmare. I reached inside my woolen turtleneck and pulled out the gold locket, the one I had taken from Captain Borodin's hidden safe. I let the gold chain dangle right in front of his eyes. The 3 small diamonds caught the flickering light of the candle, casting tiny, cold sparks across his sweaty forehead. Ivan stopped crying. He looked at the locket, then looked up at my scarred face, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He finally understood. This wasn't a gang war. This wasn't about black market gold or territory. The past had come back from the dead to collect a debt that couldn't be paid with rubles. "Kolya," Ivan whispered, his voice dropping to a dry, desperate rattle. "It was 4 years ago. A mistake. A stupid mistake. We didn't know she was your wife. Pasha said she was just an ordinary woman from the northern district. We just wanted the gold, the locket. She wouldn't stop screaming, Kolya. She wouldn't let go of the chain. Pasha hit her. We didn't mean for her to die. I didn't touch her, I swear. It was all Pasha. You ordered it," I said softly. My voice was quieter than the winter wind outside, but it filled the room like heavy stone. You ran this town. Nothing happened without your word. You let your rabid dogs loose on the streets, and when they slaughtered my Maria, you paid the militia to hide her body in a nameless ditch. You thought a 12-year sentence in the camps would erase me. But the camps didn't erase me, Ivan. They just sharpened me. I reached across the desk, grabbed him by his greasy hair, and dragged his heavy body out of the chair, throwing him onto the hard wooden floorboards. He wept and begged, groveling at my boots, trying to kiss the dirty leather of my shoes. He promised me houses, luxury cars, women, routes to Europe through the black market, everything he had stolen from this country during his years of crime. I didn't listen. I took a heavy nylon rope from my pocket, the same rope his thugs used to tie up their black market cargo, and bound his legs tightly to the heavy iron radiator beneath the shattered window. I wrapped the cord over and over until the joints turned purple and his circulation stopped. He screamed as the freezing air from the blizzard outside began to pour through the broken window panes, hitting his face like 100 tiny needles of ice. "I'm not going to waste a single bullet on you, Ivan," I said, stepping back toward the doorway. "That would be a luxury. The Siberian frost is a much better judge. It takes its time. It freezes the blood in your veins inch by inch, until your heart simply forgets how to beat. That is exactly what my Maria felt when your boys left her in that dark alley." I walked to the desk, took the candle and blew it out, plunging the room into absolute freezing blackness. Ivan began to scream, a loud, maddening howl of pure terror that echoed through the empty, dead dacha. He begged me not to leave him in the dark. He begged for a quick death. He invoked the names of saints he had never believed in. I walked down the stairs, stepped out through the broken kitchen window, and walked back into the howling blizzard. By morning, the temperature inside that room would drop to -40. By morning, the king of the black market would be nothing but a frozen statue of meat and bone, staring with blind, icy eyes into the dark corner of his empty room. Later, the state newspapers didn't write a single word about it. In the Soviet Union, organized crime supposedly didn't exist, and an entire gang being wiped out by a single ghost was something the party leaders couldn't admit to the public. They buried the files in the deepest archives of the KGB, labeling it as an internal dispute between black market syndicates. They searched for the executioner for months, closing roads and checking the identity papers of every worker in the region. But they were looking for a gang. They were looking for a professional hitman from Moscow. They never suspected the quiet, scarred veteran who worked the night shift at the railway timber yard, living in a tiny basement room on the edge of the industrial zone. I never left this town. I have nowhere else to go. My youth is gone, buried somewhere in the frozen mud of Camp 36. My future died 4 years ago in a dark alley behind the state bakery. I am just a ghost walking through a world made of gray concrete and dirty snow. But sometimes on the coldest winter nights, when the wind howls through the narrow spaces between the apartment buildings and the frost paints white patterns on my cellar window, the silence doesn't feel so heavy anymore. I sit in the dark, and I look at the gold locket resting on my wooden table. The 3 small diamonds still catch the dim light of the street lamp outside. I didn't save her. I couldn't bring her back to life, but I kept my promise. I cleaned her name from their dirty lies. In a land where the law is a rotten joke written by thieves, blood was the only truth left. I paid the debt in full. And now, the monsters know that even in the darkest corner of Siberia, justice doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes it wears a worn-out worker's jacket, and it carries 12 years of absolute freezing hell in its eyes. The fire of my revenge has finally burned out, leaving nothing but cold, black ash. But you must understand, my story is just one of many. In those brutal years, the Soviet Union was full of stories just like this one. Thousands of families were destroyed by corrupt militia and ruthless gangs, and thousands of men had to take the law into their own hands because the system was rotten to the core. Most of these tragic stories were buried forever under the Siberian snow and hidden in secret archives. If this story touched your heart and you want to hear more untold tales from that dark era, please leave a like on this video. Your support helps the channel grow and brings these hidden secrets to light. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video. Thank you for watching, stay safe in the dark, and I will see you in the next story.